God's chosen ones, welcome. Before we go any further, I want you to comment 777 if your spirit has ever cried out, "Where was everyone when I needed them most?" And to those who have supported this mission through super thanks, I see you, I thank you, and heaven records it. Your love fuels this message. Now listen closely. This one is sacred, not safe, not sanitized, sacred, because what you're about to hear isn't just truth, it's exposure. You didn't land on this video by mistake. This is a divine confrontation, and your soul has been summoned for a reason. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were thrown into a battle you didn't ask for, while the ones closest to you stood by and said nothing? Have you ever looked around in the middle of your storm and realized the silence was louder than the attack? Because while your enemies were loud, the ones who could have defended you chose to whisper, or worse, to stay quiet. You were the headline in a spiritual coliseum you didn't volunteer for. They threw you to the lions. Not only that, they sat front row, not with tears, but with snacks. Some even brought wine and toasted while you bled. And as you lay broken in spirit, they giggled like it was entertainment. And here's the part that stings. 88% of people who witness injustice stay silent, not because they're blind, but because they believe silence will save them. They don't want to choose sides, so they pretend neutrality is nobility. But neutrality during evil isn't safety, it's participation. So, what side did they pick? When they didn't speak up, when they didn't check in, when they turned their heads, they voted. Silence was a signature, indifference was an offering, and now the God who watches when no one else does is responding. Yes, God saw it all. Not just the scheming in the shadows, but the inaction in broad daylight. Not just the attacks, but the applause behind the scenes. And here's the twist. This isn't about getting even. This isn't about pettiness. It's about reckoning, a divine one, a response from heaven itself that no one can escape. Because God's version of payback isn't loud. It's undeniable. He doesn't throw tantrums, he unveils truth. And when he does, those who mocked you will witness your rise in stunned silence. Those who stayed quiet will feel the weight of what they didn't say. And those who thought they'd never be held accountable are now on heaven's radar. So buckle your spirit. What's coming isn't a motivational quote or a feel-good moment. This is biblical. And in the next moments, we're going to uncover what your silence actually accomplished, why your wounds became your witness, and how their laughter, yes, even their laughter, became their loudest confession. If they're watching this video right now, let them lean in, because this isn't just your moment of truth, it's their moment of consequence. And trust me, nobody escapes the eye of the Almighty. Let's go deeper. God's chosen ones. Payback time. God saw it all. They watched them attack you and did nothing. Let's make something clear. When you were walking through fire, the silence around you wasn't neutral. It was a statement. It was louder than words. Those who stood by and said nothing were not innocent spectators. Spiritually, they were participants. You may have been the one under attack, but their quietness became fuel to the fire that consumed you, and you felt it. Deep down, you knew they weren't just not getting involved. They were silently aligning with the darkness coming against you. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. Galatians 6:7. In the spiritual realm, silence during injustice isn't passive, it is agreement. The moment someone witnesses slander, manipulation, betrayal, or cruelty, and refuses to intervene, even gently, they are no longer innocent. They may not have spoken words aloud, but their silence shouted, "I'm okay with this." What do you call someone who sees the wound, has the remedy, but walks away? Just like the priest and the Levite in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10:25-37, they saw the man bleeding by the roadside, but crossed to the other side. They didn't harm him physically, but their refusal to act made them part of the problem. Meanwhile, the Samaritan, the one least expected to help, became the healer. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? Luke 10:36. Could it be that the ones you trusted most chose distance, while those with no title or position might have been the ones willing to offer a hand? You might remember the powerful words of Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. His words echo through history, and they echo through your life right now. The ones who claimed it wasn't their place to speak were, in reality, choosing to stay comfortable while your spirit was being ripped apart. Let me tell you about Janelle, a quiet school teacher from a small town. Just 3 months ago, her colleagues began to ostracize her after she reported a pattern of unethical behavior by the administration. She wasn't loud, she didn't go public. But what hurt most wasn't the pushback from those in power. It was the friends who stopped talking to her, the ones who smiled when convenient, but vanished when truth cost them something. Today, Janelle has been offered a leadership position in a different school district, this time with integrity at its core. But her journey left a mark. It reminded her that sometimes the silence of others is the heaviest sound of all. Who stayed silent in your valley? And why did their silence feel sharper than the words of your enemies? Spiritually, many of those around you didn't just avoid defending you. They benefited from your struggle. Some used your name in their gossip circles while pretending to care. Others stayed quiet because your downfall gave them more room to rise. Like Judas at the table, close enough to kiss, but scheming for silver. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Psalm 41:9. Imagine a wildfire breaking out in a dry forest. The trees nearby don't ignite immediately, but they absorb the heat. That's what their silence did. It didn't spark the blaze, but it allowed the flames to spread unchecked. Their neutrality created a spiritual greenhouse for injustice to thrive. The Bible is clear. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. James 4:17. That verse wasn't written just for evildoers. It was written for those who saw evil and chose silence. God doesn't merely weigh actions. He weighs intentions, motives, and omissions. Have you ever wondered how many lives are destroyed not by the wicked, but by those who look away? When you are one of God's chosen ones, every spiritual witness to your suffering is also put on trial. I once heard the story of Matteo, a young entrepreneur who was publicly discredited by a jealous investor. He lost his business, his name dragged through the mud. But what broke him wasn't the lies. It was that his best friend of 8 years, who knew the truth, said nothing, not even a text. Years later, when Matteo launched a new tech company that took off internationally, that same friend reached out with a casual, "Proud of you." But Matteo had learned, not everyone silent in your storm deserves a seat at your table when the sun returns. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. Proverbs 27:6. And what about you? Have you replayed the moments in your mind, the people who saw the tears behind your smile, who knew what was happening and still looked away? Did it sting more than the actual betrayal? Because the sword of a stranger wounds, but the silence of someone close to you That breaks the soul. Don't be fooled by their excuses. I didn't want drama. It wasn't my place. I just wanted peace. Peace without truth is not peace. It's permission. Could their fake peace have been more important than your real pain? When you are a chosen one, neutrality is not an option. The battlefield is spiritual and the lines are clear. Choosing silence in your moment of affliction was choosing the side of fear, not faith. Even nature teaches us this truth. Think of a mother bird. When danger nears her nest, she doesn't pretend not to see. She flutters, she screams, she throws herself in the line of fire, not because she's brave, but because she cares. And those who claim to care about you, but stayed conveniently uninvolved while you were wounded, cared more about appearances than your soul. Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. Proverbs 24:11. God took note. He saw who watched, who benefited, who said nothing when the stones were thrown. And rest assured, he is not mocked. The time of accountability is coming, for them and for you. Because what was allowed to happen in silence will now be answered with divine volume. And now, the silence that once protected them is being shattered by the voice of justice. Here's the part no one likes to admit, especially those who kept their distance. Some of them didn't help you because they were secretly relieved that it wasn't them. Your pain became their protection. Your struggle gave them something to hide behind. As long as the storm hovered over your life, they believed their world was safe from exposure. You were their unspoken sacrifice, their spiritual scapegoat, the one chosen to endure the fire while they watched from the shadows. But what happens when God starts to reverse the equation? Some of them didn't just stay silent. They felt secure in your suffering. Have you ever sensed that someone was quietly pleased when things went wrong for you? They didn't clap out loud, but they smiled on the inside. They didn't speak against you, but their indifference betrayed a secret satisfaction. Why? Because seeing a chosen one stumble made them feel less threatened by your calling. In the book of Leviticus 16, the high priest would lay hands on a scapegoat, symbolically transferring the sins of the people before sending it into the wilderness to bear the burden alone. Sound familiar? That's what you became in their eyes, someone to carry the weight while they remained clean, untouched, and uninvolved. But what they didn't realize is that you weren't exiled. You were consecrated. Can a person really claim to love you if they found comfort in your collapse? Let me tell you about Derek, a young speaker whose rising influence stirred quiet envy among his peers. When false accusations surfaced, those who had once shared stages with him suddenly went silent. Behind closed doors, some even said, "Maybe this is good for him. Maybe he needed humbling." But Derek didn't disappear. He entered a season of refinement, studied scripture like never before, and now, only a year later, he's been invited to speak at the very conference that once rejected him. The silence of others didn't kill his calling, it confirmed it. And this isn't just the story of the unknown or the overlooked. It's also the story of the famous. Take Simone Biles, the world-renowned gymnast. When she stepped away from Olympic competition to prioritize her mental health, not everyone stood with her. Many stayed silent, while others subtly celebrated her crack as a way to reaffirm their own narratives. But what they didn't see was that her courage wasn't weakness, it was a spiritual stand. And now, she's not only returned stronger, but she's redefined what strength looks like on the global stage. God didn't let her fall, he let her rise with clarity. And now that the smoke has cleared, those same people want to return. They want to laugh again, check in again, stand near you again, pretending like nothing ever happened. But the atmosphere has changed. Something irreversible took place in the silence. A line was drawn. You crossed over into a realm of spiritual maturity they didn't follow you into. As the prophet Malachi once wrote, "Then you will again see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, between those who serve God and those who do not. Malachi 3:18. God didn't just observe you during that season, He observed them. He saw who checked out when the battle got intense. He saw who watched you drown in betrayal, injustice and spiritual warfare, and said nothing. Their silence was louder than the false words of your enemies. Their absence spoke volumes, and heaven recorded every second. What if the true test wasn't your suffering, but their silence? Now the tide has turned, the spiritual winds have shifted, and judgment, divine, holy, precise, is beginning to move. But here's the plot twist. Doing nothing wasn't the safe option after all. Ignoring evil doesn't excuse anyone. God isn't just the defender of the broken, He is the discerner of hearts. The Lord is a God who knows, and by Him deeds are weighed. 1 Samuel 2:3. And now those who once stood still will have no choice but to stand still again, but this time as witnesses to what God is about to do for you. The same ones who stayed silent while you suffered are about to have front row seats to your elevation. The difference? This time there's no mute button. This time they can't unsee your vindication. Imagine standing in a courtroom where the verdict is read aloud. Everyone is silent, not out of respect, but because the truth has landed like thunder. That's what's coming. You won't need to announce it. You won't need to prove anything. God Himself is about to declare your name in places they tried to erase it from. This isn't revenge. This is revelation. And when it comes, no one will be able to act like they weren't there. There's a reason God didn't step in right away. It wasn't because He overlooked you. It wasn't because He was indifferent to the pain. It was because you, chosen one, were not the victim in this plan. You were the key piece in a divine trap. You weren't abandoned. You were positioned like bait, not to be devoured, but to draw out what was hidden. Think back. How many times did you wonder why certain people were allowed near you? Why doors opened just wide enough for betrayal to walk through? Why voices that once praised you suddenly turned sharp, cold, and cruel? What you didn't know was that heaven was watching silently while hell exposed itself loudly. The people who lied boldly, smiled falsely, and touched you with unclean motives, they weren't sent to destroy you. They were lured into the open so they could be unmasked. Just as Judas had to kiss Jesus to reveal his treachery, so too did your betrayers have to get close enough to be caught. Judas didn't betray from afar. He came near, called Him Master, and gave Him a kiss. And Jesus let it happen, not because He was powerless, but because prophecy had to be fulfilled. Could it be the same with you? That the betrayal had to touch your cheek for justice to strike its target? God delayed His hand not out of absence, but out of wisdom, because if He had interrupted too soon, they would have spun the story, they would have twisted the facts, they would have claimed innocence and painted themselves as misunderstood victims. And just like a prosecutor gathering evidence before the trial, God needed you to remain still, quiet, and present. You weren't weak, you were observant. Every fake hug, every whisper behind your back, every sideways glance, they were all submitted into the evidence vault of heaven. Let me tell you about Mariah, a soft-spoken graphic designer who worked in a busy creative firm in Toronto. She kept her head down, delivered excellent work, and trusted her team. But jealousy brewed, whispers started, her concepts were stolen, and credit was taken behind closed doors. For months, her supervisor watched without saying a word. And then one day, during a quarterly review, the truth unraveled. Emails exposed, timelines cross-checked, and lies laid bare. The ones who sought to bury her ended up revealing their own dishonor. Mariah was promoted. The rest? Let go quietly. That's what's happening to you. You weren't being punished. You were being refined in silence while the snake slithered out into the light. Imagine a spider web stretched between branches in the morning mist. To the naked eye, It's invisible, but when the sun rises and dew settles, the whole design is exposed. That's your life right now. God has allowed the light to shift so that every thread of deception is now visible, not just to you, but to everyone watching. And when the venom came, because it did come, it wasn't just a sting. It was a signal, a holy exposure. The poison they thought would ruin you became the proof of who they really were. You see, God didn't let the attack happen because he forgot about you. He let it happen because it would reveal the nature of the attacker. Remember David in the Psalms crying out, "Let them fall into the pit they dug for me." Psalm 57 verse 6. That cry echoes now in your story. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought your silence was weakness. But it wasn't silence. It was strategy. And the strategy was divine. Even Cardinal Robert Serra, a modern voice of wisdom in the Catholic Church, once said, "Silence is not an absence. It is a presence, a most intense presence." That's what your silence was. Not abandonment. Presence, intensity, patience. You weren't unaware. You were being aligned with heaven's timing. There was once a man named Lennox, a teacher in Johannesburg, falsely accused of manipulating students. He kept quiet. He prayed. He showed up to court with nothing but God's word and the truth. The investigation revealed a conspiracy led by a fellow teacher envious of his reputation. Lennox didn't just win the case. He started a mentorship program for at-risk boys that now serves over 1,000 young men across South Africa. These stories aren't random. They are echoes of your reality. You've endured the stings. You've smiled through the sabotage. You've wept silently when no one knew the weight you carried. But God knew, and he allowed the stage to stay lit just long enough for masks to melt and intentions to reveal themselves. That's why it had to happen just like this. God was never going to save your image if it meant sacrificing your future. He wasn't going to rescue your comfort if it meant letting snakes slither beside you longer. He let the venom show you who needed to leave. Now, the veil has lifted. The charade has ended. Those who thought they were dancing around you in victory were actually circling the edge of a divine trap. You thought the setup was meant to break you, but it was actually meant to expose them. And now, chosen one, the net is closing, not around you, but around them. And this time, you won't be the one explaining. You'll be the one watching, because this isn't just vindication, it's revelation. And God is leading the charge. There's a reason God didn't step in right away. He could have. He saw everything the moment it began, every whispered lie, every fake embrace, every passive glance. But instead of stopping it early, he let the drama unfold completely. Why? Because the truth needed to be undeniable. He allowed the stage to stay lit long enough for every actor to remove their mask, not just in word, but in behavior. This was no longer about misunderstandings or emotional moments. This was about decisions, intentions, and exposure. If God had intervened too soon, the jealous cousin would have still looked like a cheerleader. The fake friend could have still played the loyal confidant. The co-worker who smiled in your face but rolled their eyes behind your back would have kept their hands clean. But by letting it all play out, raw and unfiltered, God ensured no one could rewrite the story later. Like in the parable of the wheat and the tares, Matthew 13:24-30, God let them grow side by side, so the difference would be crystal clear when it was time to separate them. Now they can't say, "I didn't mean to." They can't claim, "It wasn't personal," or "I was just going through something," because the evidence is everywhere, loud, public, and permanent. They didn't just make mistakes, they made choices. And while you were left bleeding, they either watched, walked away, or worse, picked up a stone and joined in. Let me tell you about Marcus, a young architect in his 30s. A few months ago, a client falsely accused him of stealing design plans. His team, the very people he trained and nurtured, distanced themselves overnight. His name was dragged through articles and offices, and no one said a word. But Marcus stayed silent. He didn't fight back, not because he was weak, but because he trusted the author of his story. Today, not only was he cleared of all accusations, but the same client who tried to destroy him is now under investigation. God didn't just clear Marcus's name. He built a platform through his pain. Isn't that the way God works? Think of Joseph again, sold by his own brothers, falsely imprisoned, forgotten by those he helped. God could have rescued him after the betrayal, but he waited. He let Pharaoh have his dreams. He let Egypt feel the famine. He let time pass until the right moment when Joseph's vindication would carry not just justice, but promotion. Joseph didn't just get free, he got the palace. What if your delay wasn't punishment, but preparation? What if God let the betrayal stretch out because the exposure had to be complete? Just as gold must be refined through intense heat, your pain had to be sustained long enough to reveal what couldn't come with you into the next season. Sometimes people ask why divine justice feels slow, but God doesn't move on surface-level impressions. He moves when the full truth is undeniable. He gives time for repentance, for confession, for a change of heart. That was grace, and they rejected it. So now, what's coming is no longer preventable, not because God is cruel, but because his justice is perfect. Proverbs 29:1 warns, "Whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed without remedy." Imagine a volcano. For months, even years, it seems still, quiet, dormant. But beneath the surface, pressure builds, heat rises, and the earth takes note of every unseen shift. And then, without warning, it erupts. That's what's happening now. Heaven is erupting with response, not out of anger alone, but out of holy justice. And this time, no one watching will be able to say, "I didn't see that coming." Even world-renowned speaker and author Brené Brown once said, "Integrity is choosing courage over comfort." When the people around you chose comfort, silence, and convenience, they chose to forfeit their integrity. And God took note. You didn't need to defend yourself. You didn't need to retaliate. Heaven was building the case for you. And I want you to remember something else. During all of this, you weren't just hurt. You were watched. Your patience was witnessed. Your restraint was recorded. Just like David, who had multiple chances to kill Saul, but chose honor instead. David didn't force the throne. He waited for God to give it. And when it came with legacy, not just victory. You are not the victim in this story. You are the vessel of vindication. Your suffering was not wasted. It was strategic. And now that the full picture has been revealed, accountability is unavoidable. Every word, every silence, every betrayal, it's been written, not in ink, in eternity. The wait wasn't a delay in justice. It was an opportunity for mercy that they refused. And now what's coming will come swiftly, unmistakably, and undeniably, not for your revenge, but for God's glory. And this time, no one will be confused. Everyone will know exactly why. They thought they had time because you were kind. They thought they were safe because you smiled. They assumed silence meant surrender. But what they failed to realize is that God hides fire in quiet vessels. You, chosen one, were never weak. You were waiting. Not waiting in fear, but waiting in divine restraint. They looked at your calm and misread it as cowardice. But they didn't know the kind of storm heaven stores in those who pray before they speak. Like Esther in the palace, you kept your posture. You didn't lash out, even when the insults came in whispers wrapped as compliments. You didn't fight back, even when your name was dragged through rooms you never entered. And just like Esther, who waited for the right moment to reveal Haman's plot. You understood that timing was part of the battle plan, because power without timing is noise. But timing with power, that's prophecy unfolding. You were assigned to that space not to react, but to reveal. And in your stillness, the truth surfaced. You were sent in as the silent recorder, not the first to strike. Because some lessons can only be taught when the enemy grows comfortable enough to show their real face. There's a quote by the poet Atticus that says, "Watch carefully the magic that occurs when you give a person just enough rope to hang themselves." That's what they didn't see. Your peace was not passive. It was permission from heaven to document everything, every whisper, every manipulation, every fake apology disguised as concern. You caught it all, and instead of clapping back, you submitted it to divine jurisdiction. Let me tell you about Aidan, a quiet maintenance worker at a corporate tower in Boston. He rarely spoke, but always noticed. When a major data breach exposed thousands of clients, the company was ready to fire him, blaming him without evidence. But Aidan had kept logs. He had documented anomalies, forwarded warnings, and had video time stamps. When the investigation concluded, the real culprit was revealed, one of the top executives. Aidan didn't just keep his job, he was promoted to internal security lead. The one they thought was the easiest target became the protector of the very system they tried to collapse. That's what God is doing in your story. While they were poking the lamb, they forgot you were a lion in disguise. Just like Jesus, who remained silent before his accusers, not because he lacked words, but because he was standing in front of a courtroom heaven had already ruled on. Do you remember what God told Elijah? "I was not in the wind, or the fire, or the earthquake, but in a still small voice." 1 Kings 19:11-12. That's you, the still small voice, the presence they overlooked because it didn't shake tables, but that same quiet carried power that now overturns kingdoms. Imagine a volcano resting beneath a lush, peaceful valley. Birds chirp, the breeze is soft, everything looks serene, but underneath is pressure, molten justice, stored energy waiting for God's command. You were never harmless. You were hidden. They laughed because they thought you wouldn't move. But now the shift has begun. Doors are opening in places they swore you'd never reach. Favor is flowing into your life like rivers in the desert. And for them, the things they once relied on are unraveling with no clear cause. Because the hand they provoked was not yours, it was God's. Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who resisted Nazi tyranny, once said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil." But chosen one, your silence wasn't complicity, it was strategy. God had you stand still, not to blend in, but to expose. And now that the unveiling has begun, they're fumbling for grace in a season they never prepared for. You were kind because you had nothing to prove. You were calm because you knew who backed you. And now, as justice rolls in, not as noise but as divine order, they'll finally understand. The quietest warriors carry the sharpest swords. Because in the kingdom of God, softness isn't weakness, it's precision. They didn't just witness your suffering, they enjoyed it. Not openly, of course, they didn't say it out loud, but in the smirks they traded, in the quiet chuckles that passed through their group chats, in the memes they created, using your pain as a punchline. They made it clear. Your collapse was their content. Your agony was their amusement. While you were trying to breathe under the weight of spiritual warfare, crying into your pillow and asking God for just one more ounce of strength to get through the day, they were screenshotting your vulnerability and circulating it like gossip. They didn't just stand by and watch the blood fall. They studied the flow, took mental notes, and turned your breakdown into their entertainment. Some of them, the ones who called themselves friends, sat in silence. Others stirred the fire behind closed doors, whispering words to encourage the chaos in your life, just enough to push you to the edge. Why? so they could stand back and say, "See, I knew something was off with them. They didn't want your healing. They wanted your breaking." This isn't just cruelty, it's spiritual failure. And what they didn't understand is that your suffering wasn't just about you. It was a divine test for them. How would they respond to someone chosen being crushed? Would they offer a hand or hurl a joke? Would they intercede or interfere? King David once cried out in Psalm 35:15-16, "But when I stumbled, they gathered in glee. Assailants gathered against me without my knowledge. They slandered me without ceasing. Like the ungodly, they maliciously mocked. They gnashed their teeth at me." That was your reality. And just like in David's story, God took note, not just of the words they said, but of the spirit they carried when they said it. Let me tell you about Leora. She was a university counselor, quiet, compassionate, always ready to help others. But when she went through a brutal divorce after years of silent abuse, her colleagues didn't support her. They whispered. One even joked that she must have deserved it. While she fought for custody and tried to hold her mental health together, her pain became an office rumor. But today, Leora leads a national initiative for trauma recovery in women, honored by the very people who once doubted her strength. The same story they laughed at is now printed in headlines. That's what God does with the ashes they mocked. He turns them into pillars of fire, and you, chosen one, are becoming the flame. Imagine a seed underground, cold, crushed, forgotten, and above it, people walk, trample, laugh, unaware that what they're stepping on is about to burst through the soil in glory. That seed is you. The darkness they mocked was your incubation. The silence they interpreted as weakness was your sacred growth. And now that you're rising, the same mouths that laughed are speechless. Even C.S. Lewis once said, "The pain now is part of the happiness later. That's the deal." But what they didn't see is that your pain wasn't just shaping your future. It was weighing theirs. Every joke was a verdict. Every smirk was recorded. Not just in human memory, but in heaven's courtroom. And now, God is not just correcting the record. He is issuing judgment, not petty revenge, but divine response. Because when they laughed at you, they weren't just mocking a person, they were mocking what God was doing in you. Your struggle was sacred, your breakdown was prophetic, and they turned it into a sideshow. That's not just offensive, it's damning. You were never weak, you were never broken beyond repair. What you were was a walking altar, and every tear you shed was a sacrifice that heaven received in full. They didn't know that while they were building gossip, you were building glory. Let me share about Thomas, a high school teacher who wore second-hand clothes, spoke gently, and endured endless jokes from both students and peers. What they didn't know was that he spent his nights caring for a mother with Alzheimer's and mentoring orphaned teens on weekends. Years later, a former student, now a public speaker, honored Thomas on national television as the person who saved his life. The same jokes faded, but the testimony remained. So now, chosen one, the silence they're experiencing. That's not peace, it's judgment loading. Heaven didn't forget. God wasn't late. He just let the full recording play long enough so that when the verdict comes down, it will be undeniable, irreversible, and just. Because when you touch one of God's chosen, you don't just risk exposure, you activate divine response. They didn't know your name echoed in courts higher than theirs, and now they will. God didn't allow the public humiliation because he forgot you. He allowed it because he was staging a divine reversal, one that would unfold so visibly, so dramatically, that even your enemies wouldn't be able to deny the hand of heaven on your life. Every moment of disgrace, every lie passed like wildfire, every headline that only existed in the mouths of the jealous, it was all part of the script. But you, chosen one, were not the punchline. You were the prophecy. They watched you lose what they thought defined you: respect, stability, favor, identity. They circled your failure like vultures, feasting on assumptions. "This is it," they whispered. "They've finally collapsed." And why did that comfort them so much? Because your light had always exposed their shadows. Your anointing unsettled their mediocrity, and your presence reminded them of everything they never had the courage to become. So, when the storm came, they celebrated, not because they were heartless, but because they were insecure. They weren't rooting for your downfall. They were relieved by it. They thought if you stayed down, they wouldn't have to confront what your rise revealed in them. But here's what they never saw coming. Your downfall wasn't real. It was a setup for something far greater. You weren't being crushed. You were being crystallized. Think of Jesus, beaten, mocked, paraded through the streets carrying a cross. The people watched. They laughed. They shook their heads. And when the stone rolled over the tomb, they thought it was finished. But 3 days later, the very crowd that shouted, "Crucify him," heard rumors that he had risen. They didn't just witness the suffering. They became involuntary witnesses to the resurrection. And now it's happening to you. Let me tell you about Yasmin, a fashion entrepreneur who had her name dragged through the mud when a false plagiarism accusation went viral. Her designs were pulled, her brand collapsed overnight. People unfollowed, stores cancelled orders, and tabloids had a field day. She vanished. But what no one knew was that during that quiet season, she was building something new. A year later, she relaunched under a new name. That brand, now featured in Paris Fashion Week with the same bloggers who mocked her now begging for interviews. And let's not forget what God said in Isaiah 61:7. "Instead of your shame, you shall receive a double portion, and everlasting joy will be yours." God doesn't just restore, He multiplies. He doesn't just vindicate quietly, He orchestrates moments where every eye that saw your breakdown now bears witness to your comeback. Can you feel it already? The shift in the atmosphere. The same group chat that once mocked you now watches in silence. The same hallway where you were gossiped about now echoes with your name, this time in admiration, not scorn. You were never truly buried, you were planted. And the dirt they used to cover you became the soil of your acceleration. Picture a seed, left in darkness, pushed into soil, rained on, stepped over. To the eye, it looks forgotten, but underneath it's breaking open, forming roots, reaching toward light. And one morning, it breaks through, unapologetically, boldly. That's your life. You're not recovering, you're blooming. Even Pope Benedict XVI once said, "The world offers you comfort, but you were not made for comfort, you were made for greatness." That greatness doesn't come without trials, but it also never ends with defeat. Let me tell you about Darian. He was a youth pastor who lost everything in one false accusation. His silence was interpreted as guilt, his tears seen as weakness. But in that wilderness, God spoke to him like He spoke to Moses, away from the crowds, in the quiet. 2 years later, Darian was invited to lead a multi-city revival that reached thousands, including the very church that once closed its doors on him. His pain became his platform. His scar became his story. That's what God is doing with your life. He's matching the depth of your humiliation with the height of your elevation. He's not doing it in secret. No, He's preparing a table in the presence of your enemies. Psalm 23, verse 5. That means they don't just hear about your breakthrough. They watch it, step by step. They used your name like it was a scandal, but now your name is echoing in rooms they can't enter. Your blessings are multiplying in ways they can't explain. And the peace you carry, it radiates louder than any rumor they ever spread. This isn't just a comeback. It's divine payback. Strategic, visible, unstoppable. And the most powerful part, they have to watch all of it. There was a moment, quiet but unforgettable, when they saw what was happening to you. They looked directly at the betrayal, the ridicule, the injustice, and made a choice. to stay silent. They thought silence was safety, that staying on the sidelines meant they wouldn't get burned. But what they didn't realize is that in the eyes of heaven, neutrality in the face of injustice is not neutrality at all. It's silent alliance with darkness. It is complicity dressed in comfort. Now that divine justice has begun its quiet yet undeniable unfolding in your favor, something strange is happening to them. Not punishment in the form of disaster, but in the form of memory, the kind that won't go away. Regret is now a steady companion, whispering in the quiet corners of their lives. They thought staying out of it meant staying clean, but now they're stained by every word they didn't say, every moment they chose comfort over conviction. This is exactly what happened in the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man was beaten and left for dead on the road. A priest passed by, a Levite passed by. Both had status, both had reasons, and both had excuses. But it was the Samaritan, an outsider, who stopped, helped, and rewrote the narrative. Those who passed by are remembered not for what they did, but for what they didn't do. How many people in your life now live with the haunting reality that they were there and did nothing? Let me tell you about Mara, a quiet woman in her 40s who used to work in a small-town school. When one of her colleagues was being publicly shamed by students and staff for a mistake she didn't commit, Mara stayed silent, thinking, "This isn't my fight." But years later, as the innocent teacher rebuilt her life and found peace, Mara's heart remained heavy. She couldn't escape the truth. She wasn't the villain, but she was no hero either. And that truth visits her every time she sees justice unfold. Not loudly, but in the stillness before sleep. God's justice doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in mirrors. And those mirrors don't reflect your fall. They reflect what others failed to become when you needed them most. They reflect the friend who could have spoken up, the sibling who could have stepped in, the leader who could have shielded you, but chose the shadows instead. Even the great Bishop Desmond Tutu once said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." And that quote now echoes in the hearts of those who abandoned you. It doesn't shout, it lingers. It revisits them during a sermon, a memory, or when they see your face shining with peace that they can't touch anymore. Think of how fire refines gold. It doesn't destroy it, it purifies it. In the same way, you weren't broken by what you went through, you were purified by it. And now, your rising becomes their mirror. Your peace becomes their echo chamber. Because it's not just what happened to you that haunts them, it's what they chose not to do when they had the chance to shape the story. Let me share another story. A man named Elijah, not the prophet but a young entrepreneur, was slandered online by competitors. His so-called best friend saw it all, knew the truth, said nothing. 2 years later, Elijah launched a non-profit that helps others navigate online harassment and defamation. He's praised, celebrated, and his friend. He watches from the sidelines, silently wondering, what if I had stood by him? That question doesn't scream. It simmers. It shows up in conversations, in memories, in guilt-soaked silence. Imagine a wolf chasing a lamb while the rest of the flock watches. They believe that silence is safety, but it never is. Eventually, the wolf returns. And the flock realizes they were never safe, only next. Now they're haunted, not by what was done to you, but by their absence from your defense, by the integrity they sacrificed, by the courage they buried. And that weight doesn't come off easily. It becomes a shadow that follows them not just through your success, but through your joy, your healing, your peace. Because they know you didn't just survive, you thrived without them. The haunting is quiet. It's not thunder, it's a whisper, a thought during a birthday, a memory triggered by a photograph, a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, and in that moment, they hear it again. What if I had helped? That is the sound of divine justice. It doesn't just punish the wrongdoers, it awakens the silent ones. It opens their conscience and seats them in the very courtroom of their own choices. And the sentence is this: they must live with the reality that they had the chance to be brave, loyal, and honorable, and they chose silence. They thought their distance would protect them, but now it has isolated them. Their silence has become their prison. Their regret has become their teacher. And what haunts them most is not your pain, but your triumph. That they blinked while a chosen one bled. That they could have been part of the redemption, but chose to blend into the background instead. And that whisper, "What if I had helped?" It never fades. It only grows louder with time. They didn't see the shift in the atmosphere, but they're about to feel it in their bones. Not all justice arrives with the sound of sirens or the slam of a courtroom gavel. Sometimes it arrives in frequencies too high for the human ear to catch, yet potent enough to disrupt the very rhythm of someone's life. This isn't the kind of payback that makes headlines or inspires viral quotes about karma. This is holy recompense. The kind that doesn't just shake their world, it rewires it from the inside out. It begins quietly, a creeping discomfort in their spirit, like static in the air before a storm. They won't understand why their peace has evaporated, why their relationships grow brittle, or why success suddenly slips through their fingers like sand. But you will understand, because what they're experiencing isn't coincidence, it's consequence. You don't need revenge when God Himself responds. His justice flows in silence, not spectacle. This is what happened to King Saul. When he turned from God's voice and tried to control the outcome by his own hand, the anointing departed from him. No one blew a trumpet to announce it. No prophet shouted, "It's over." Yet from that moment on, Saul's life unraveled. His crown remained, but his peace was gone. His decisions grew erratic. Jealousy consumed him. He was tormented by forces he couldn't name, because the spirit that once filled him had quietly withdrawn. That's what they don't realize. God doesn't always respond with fire from heaven. Sometimes He simply removes His hand. And when He does, it's like oxygen leaving a room they didn't even know He filled. Suddenly, their charm falls flat. Their finances dwindle without reason, and their health begins to decline despite every remedy. It won't be obvious to outsiders, but internally their soul is screaming for something they can't name. Why won't anything work anymore? Why does everything feel cursed? Let me tell you about Daniela, a young entrepreneur who once stole from her business partner and publicly humiliated her to get ahead. For months she thrived. New clients, big contracts, praise from all directions. But slowly, without warning, things shifted. Her ideas stopped working. She lost her best clients without explanation. At night she couldn't sleep, and in the mirror her confidence began to look like fear dressed in bold lipstick. What had changed? She couldn't point to a single thing, but her spirit knew she had touched someone she should have left alone. Like waves breaking silently against a distant shore, divine justice doesn't need to announce itself. It moves through energy, through unseen laws woven into the fabric of existence. Just as gravity doesn't shout, yet governs every step you take, God's justice doesn't need a nameplate to work. And when it moves, even the most confident liars begin to falter. Think of a tree struck not by lightning, but by rot from within. There's no noise, no spectacle, just a slow, silent collapse until one day it falls. That's how spiritual justice works. It doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it comes as the slow disappearance of favor. This is the mystery of how God works on behalf of His chosen ones. You didn't retaliate. You didn't scream back. You stayed in the wilderness while they laughed from their thrones. But what they didn't know is that God was listening to every cry you thought no one heard. He saw every injustice, even when others stayed silent. And now, their silence will cost them everything. Have you ever noticed how butterflies must first be still before they break free from the cocoon? In that stillness, transformation happens. You were still. You didn't fight dirty, but in your stillness, heaven moved. And now the frequencies of justice are vibrating through their world, not in ways they can see, but in ways they can't escape. Even Pope Benedict XVI once said, "There is a justice which is not made by human hands, but belongs to God alone." That's the kind of justice echoing now. Not human, not explainable, divine. And when those who betrayed you finally whisper to themselves, "Why is everything falling apart?" the answer will not come from the outside. It will rise from within them like smoke from an unseen fire. You shouldn't have touched that chosen one. Your pain was never meaningless. It was a sacred entry written into a divine ledger that stretches beyond time. Every tear you shed, every insult you swallowed, every betrayal you silently endured, none of it vanished into the air. Heaven recorded it all. Not metaphorically, but literally. There is a spiritual accounting system, and your suffering became a cosmic transaction that demanded a divine response. But have you ever wondered, what if your deepest heartbreak wasn't a setback, but an entry in heaven's balance sheet? Could it be that your silence was never weakness, but strength measured and rewarded by eternity? In Psalm 56 verse 8, David cries out, "You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record?" This is not poetry alone, it is proof. God keeps records, not just of your victories, but especially of your pain. The people who mistreated you may have thought it was just another moment, just a bad mood, just a joke, just a business decision. But you know better, and so does God, because in the kingdom, motives matter. Heaven doesn't just see actions, it weighs hearts. All a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. Proverbs 16:2. And when motives are malicious, God doesn't let it slide. He audits. Let me tell you about Marcus, a quiet and humble music teacher at a private school. He helped others succeed, even covering for their mistakes. But a supervisor who felt threatened by his excellence began crafting subtle lies, manipulating leadership to edge him out. No one saw it. No alarm bells rang. Marcus lost his job, his reputation, and his purpose, all in silence. But what the supervisor didn't know was that heaven had opened a file. 5 years later, after a new administrator launched a surprise evaluation, every hidden offense came to light. She was dismissed. Marcus reinstated, with honor, back pay, and full control of his department. That's not coincidence. That's spiritual justice maturing into restoration. Do you feel like you've been forgotten, your pain dismissed as just another passing sorrow? Let me assure you, God did not overlook a single moment. Think of Joseph. His brothers betrayed him. They sold him like property. He was falsely accused, thrown in prison, forgotten by the very people he helped. But Genesis 50:20 reveals the secret. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Even betrayal has a purpose in God's justice economy. Justice doesn't always strike quickly. It's often more like the formation of a diamond, silent, slow, but unbreakable. You've been under that same pressure, and now heaven is tipping the scales in your favor. The audit has begun. Have you ever watched how a drought reveals the weakness of every shallow root? That's what's happening to them. As divine favor withdraws, their lives start cracking. Financial instability, broken relationships, emotional distress, unexpected illness. They won't be able to trace the origin, but the root is spiritual. And you'll sense it, because you were the seed buried, not the one rotting. Let's take Cardinal Robert Sarah, a revered spiritual leader known for his reflections on suffering and silence. He once said, "God's silence is not absence. It is a presence too great for words." While you cried out in isolation, God was still, but not inactive. His silence was strategy. Do you remember the nights when you asked, "Why won't anyone stand up for me?" The truth is, God was standing the entire time, measuring every word spoken against you, every glance filled with envy, every friend who conveniently disappeared when things got hard. All of it added to the spiritual debt now being collected. I could tell you about Samira, a gentle woman who shared an apartment with someone who mocked her daily prayers and laughed when she fasted. Samira stayed quiet. Years passed. Then one day, her old roommate called in desperation. "Everything in my life is falling apart," she said. "I don't know why, but I remember how calm you always were." That's the sound of the audit reaching its target. Here's the final twist. The people who caused you harm aren't just facing consequences, they are facing themselves. Their own spirit, distorted by arrogance, hardened by pride, is now reflecting back at them. This is why Galatians 6:7 warns, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows." They thought they sowed seeds into silence, but the ground was holy, and what grows from sacred soil is justice. The books are open, the audit is active, and as each line of debt is read aloud in the spirit realm, the scales shift heavily in your direction. You didn't ask for revenge, you asked for peace. And peace is coming, not just for your heart, but for your name, your purpose, your legacy. Because heaven never forgets what earth tries to bury. They didn't just ignore your pain, they mocked it. They dismissed the ache in your voice, the weight behind your silence, the tremble in your prayers. Why? Because they couldn't comprehend what they couldn't feel. And rather than admit their blindness, they laughed. They said you were too sensitive, too dramatic, always overthinking. They labeled your discernment as delusion. But the truth is, your spirit was tuned to a higher frequency, one they couldn't hear no matter how loudly heaven was trying to warn them. And now they're choking on their own words. They mocked what they never tried to understand, and now they are face to face with the very reality you sensed all along. It's not paranoia when it's prophecy. The heaviness you carried wasn't imaginary. It was spiritual. They thought they knew what pain looked like. They thought you were just being emotional, but they were confusing emotion with revelation. You weren't reacting to daily annoyances. You were responding to spiritual warfare they couldn't see because they weren't equipped to perceive it. Even Jesus faced this kind of mockery. In Mark 5, when he entered the house of Jairus to raise his daughter from the dead, the crowd laughed at him. They said, "She's already dead." But Jesus knew something they didn't. He told them she was only sleeping. They mocked what they couldn't grasp, and minutes later their laughter turned into stunned silence as the girl rose from the dead. Mark 5:40-42. God's chosen always walk in a reality that others can't yet comprehend. Have you ever noticed that shallow water ripples loudly, but deep water moves in silence? That was you, moving with quiet depth while they splashed on the surface, making noise but no impact. They couldn't fathom the currents beneath you, so they mocked what made them feel small. But now the depths are rising. The spiritual undercurrents you once felt so strongly are starting to surface, and even those who laughed can no longer deny the shift. I'll never forget hearing about Gabrielle, a young artist from Morocco. Her family called her unstable because she would isolate herself to pray and paint what she saw in her dreams. They told her she was wasting her life, that she'd never be normal. But 2 years later, one of those paintings, depicting a flood in her hometown, was eerily accurate when a flash flood struck and devastated the village. That same family now shows her artwork with reverence, whispering to guests that she knew something back then. She didn't change. Their understanding did. The tables are turning now. and not with revenge, but with revelation. They mocked you, not because they were strong, but because they were afraid. Your sensitivity unsettled them. Your awareness exposed their numbness. You heard things in silence they couldn't hear, even with all their noise. You picked up on lies before the words were spoken. You noticed betrayal before the knife was drawn. And instead of respecting your discernment, they belittled it. But as 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, "The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness." Now, the same spiritual realm they mocked is the one pressing against them. The very forces you once warned about in your quiet discomfort are now standing at their door. God's correction isn't flashy. It doesn't need a crowd. But when it comes, it is undeniable. Their laughter has grown quiet. Their confidence has grown thin. The truth is no longer a theory. It's a storm they can't outrun. Have you ever watched how fog slowly wraps around a city until even the tallest buildings vanish? That's what's happening now. The spiritual fog is settling in, and their false clarity is being replaced with divine confusion. What once seemed like certainty is now uncertainty. And in the midst of it, they remember what you said, what they once laughed at. Even the great C.S. Lewis once warned, "You never know how much you really believe anything until its truth or falsehood becomes a matter of life and death." For them, the truth they dismissed is no longer distant. It's personal, it's real, and it's knocking. Let me tell you about Elias, a quiet warehouse worker who used to journal dreams that made no sense to anyone else. His co-workers teased him, calling him the prophet. They said he was crazy, always claiming to feel spiritual energy in certain shipments. Months later, after a massive recall, it was revealed those very products were contaminated, and Elias's reports helped investigators identify the pattern. Suddenly, the prophet became the watchman. This is what happens when God vindicates you, not with fireworks, but with facts, with fulfilled discernment, with consequences that confirm your quiet warnings. The same people who once raised eyebrows at you now bow their heads in discomfort, because your pain wasn't random, your knowing wasn't weakness, and your stillness wasn't confusion. It was protection. Their arrogance blinded them, and now their eyes are opening, too late to stop what's already moving. The next time someone laughs at a depth they can't swim in, remember this: "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:10. Your mockery was never a curse. It was a mark of your calling. And now, as your truth rises from the ashes of ridicule, one lesson echoes louder than any laughter ever could. Never mock what you don't understand, because sometimes the quietest soul is carrying a word so holy. It was never meant for shallow ears. They called it peace, but it was peace purchased with your pain. While you stayed up praying through tears and spiritual warfare, they slept soundly. While you endured betrayal, abandonment, and humiliation, they scrolled, laughed, and lounged in blissful ignorance. But that kind of comfort isn't innocent. It's borrowed. It was built, brick by invisible brick, on your suffering. And in the economy of heaven, no debt like that goes unpaid. Have you ever asked yourself why some people seem to flourish while others break in silence? Could it be that what looked like ease was actually imbalance? That what looked like peace was stolen breath by breath from someone else's struggle? The nights they felt safe were nights you stayed awake, fighting off anxiety. The days they celebrated were days you walked through fire alone. They didn't realize their calm was made possible because someone else, you, was bearing the spiritual load. But heaven did. This principle is written into the justice of God. In Luke 16, Jesus tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man lived in comfort, feasting daily, while Lazarus lay at his gate in agony. The rich man never lifted a finger to help, And after death, the roles were reversed. Lazarus was comforted in Abraham's bosom, and the rich man begged for relief. His wealth couldn't pay the debt he owed, because that debt was spiritual. Luke 16:19-31. That parable wasn't about wealth. It was about responsibility, blindness and justice delayed but never denied. And now the ledger has come due. Let me tell you about Antoine, a freelance editor who always delivered more than asked. His client, a best-selling author, climbed the charts and soaked in the praise while quietly exploiting Antoine's work, delaying payments, stealing credit, and making promises he never intended to keep. Antoine said nothing. He needed the work. But after years of swallowing that mistreatment, the publisher discovered discrepancies in the author's manuscripts. Plagiarism, factual errors, and missed citations, all covered up by Antoine's unacknowledged excellence. When Antoine finally stepped back, the entire empire crumbled, and the author left speechless. That's not coincidence. That's repayment in motion. Spiritual economics are unlike any system we know. There's no hiding, no negotiation, no shortcut. When someone's comfort is bought at the expense of another's soul, heaven keeps the receipt. The peace they enjoyed while you endured torment becomes a weight on their spirit, growing heavier each day until something gives. Relationships collapse, business dries up, health wanes, confusion multiplies, and they won't understand why. But you will. Have you ever seen how a landslide begins? A hill looks stable, solid, unmoving, until one day everything shifts, not because of what's visible, but because of pressure building beneath the surface. That's how this payback is coming. The ground beneath their comfort is starting to move, and it won't be gentle. Ecclesiastes 3:15 declares, God will call the past to account. That means no act of suffering you endured is ever forgotten. Not one moment you were used, overlooked, or silenced is lost in the wind. God is calling it all back for balance. Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian who stood against the Nazi regime, once said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Those who watched your suffering and chose ease over empathy, who basked in blessings while ignoring the brokenness they contributed to, they are not exempt." They didn't need to be the one holding the knife to share the responsibility. Some of them simply watched and benefited, and that was enough to write their name on the bill. I knew someone like Eva, a gentle woman who served quietly at her church, always helping, never complaining. Her team lead regularly took credit for her ideas, accepted praise, and built influence off her hidden efforts. Years passed. One day, Eva was asked to speak at a leadership event, and when she shared her heart, her wisdom left the room in awe. Doors opened that the other woman had prayed for, but never received, because heaven remembered whose shoulders bore the real burden. This is divine justice, not emotional revenge, not petty retribution, but the holy rearranging of weight, redistributing what was taken and restoring what was lost. The spiritual law is clear. What is built on another's brokenness cannot stand. They may try to escape it. They may blame the economy, bad luck, betrayal, or even you. But deep down, their soul knows. Their comfort was never free. Someone paid for it. And now, the fire you fought to keep from spreading is starting to burn through their walls. And this time, you're not the one holding the hose. Galatians 6:9 tells you this: "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." That harvest is coming, not just of blessing for you, but of balance for the injustice. Because in the end, the universe is not blind, heaven is not passive, and the Spirit of God never forgets who paid the price in silence. The tab is due, and no comfort built on your suffering will be allowed to stand without cost. They smiled at you, not out of love, not out of loyalty, but to avoid the sharp reflection of their own cowardice. Behind every pleasant nod, behind every "I'm praying for you" and hollow encouragement, there was a silent war raging within them. Because to truly support you, God's chosen one, meant they would have to confront something terrifying, the possibility that they themselves had failed the test of courage. Have you ever wondered why some people vanish the moment your struggle begins? Why those who once laughed with you suddenly grow silent when you're under attack? It's not always hatred. Sometimes it's self-preservation disguised as politeness. Sometimes their silence is a confession they're too afraid to say out loud. Supporting someone called by God isn't easy. It demands inner strength, discernment, and the willingness to stand when it's unpopular. It's not just about being kind, it's about being courageous. But when the fire came, they chose the back row. They smiled, nodded, and stepped away. Not because they didn't care, but because caring required confrontation, and they weren't ready for that. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Whoever is not with me is against me," Matthew 12:30. There is no neutral ground in spiritual warfare. Those who stood on the sidelines while you bled may think they stayed safe. But what they really did was declare their position. Their passivity wasn't neutral, it was a choice. I'll never forget the story of Caleb, a man who went through a season of deep depression and spiritual warfare after exposing corruption at his workplace. Many of his colleagues believed him in private, but none defended him in public. They smiled in the hallways, nodded during meetings, but never once risked their own position to protect his truth. Years later, after Caleb's vindication, one of them tearfully confessed, "It wasn't that I didn't believe you, I just didn't want to deal with what it said about me." That's not unfamiliar, is it? Even Peter, the disciple who loved Jesus fiercely, denied him 3 times, not because he stopped believing, but because he couldn't bear what standing beside the truth would cost him. But unlike some, Peter broke when the rooster crowed. He wept, he repented, he returned. But most people you encountered never reached that level of honesty. Instead, they chose distance. They whispered behind your back to ease their own guilt. They acted like they didn't see your suffering, so they wouldn't have to explain why they did nothing. Their smiles became masks, thin shields covering a soul too afraid to face its own reflection. But the mirror doesn't lie forever. And when God raises you up, when your name begins to shine, not because you chased validation, but because you survived the shadows, their illusions will start to shatter. Your success becomes a spiritual mirror, revealing everything they denied in themselves. And in that mirror, they'll see not just you rising, but themselves shrinking, not because you attacked them, but because they abandoned you. In Isaiah 6:8, God asks, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah answers, "Here I am, send me." But most people never say that. Most run from the call, not just God's call, but the call to support those He sends. Because to stand with a chosen one is to share in the fire, the ridicule, the spiritual tension. It exposes the shallow foundations in others, and they don't want that exposure. Let me tell you about Miriam, a woman who was mocked at her local church for giving prophetic dreams. Even her closest friend, Layla, stayed silent as others questioned Miriam's sanity. When the dreams began to unfold exactly as spoken, Layla didn't celebrate. She distanced herself even more. Why? Because Miriam's accuracy reminded Layla of her own silence, and that silence was louder than any insult. Nature teaches this too. Have you ever watched how shadows stretch longer at sunrise? As the light increases, what once was hidden must reveal itself. That's what your rising is doing to them. Your breakthrough has become their mirror, and what they see now isn't your pain, it's their absence. What's worse is, many of them didn't just stay silent. They chose gossip over grace. They spread doubt to feel justified in their distance. But as Proverbs 17:17 says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. Their silence during your adversity proved they were never truly for you. And now, as God stretches you into greater visibility, they will have no excuse. The truth is standing tall, and the mirror they once avoided is cracked wide open, fractured not by your hand, but by the force of your resilience. You weren't just misunderstood, you were a reflection they couldn't handle. Supporting you would have meant confronting their own fear, their own jealousy, their own failure to act, and they weren't ready for that. So they smiled, turned away, and hoped the storm would pass without needing their witness. But now the storm is over, and you're still standing, and every smile they wore to cover their cowardice has turned brittle under the weight of what they refused to be. You didn't rise to make them feel small, but the truth has a way of exposing what smiles try to conceal, and today that exposure is their reckoning, not because you demanded it, but because the truth always returns to center. And the mirror, it's no longer avoiding them, it's staring back with clarity they can't escape. You weren't abandoned, you were set apart. What felt like abandonment was actually divine isolation, a sacred separation designed not to punish you, but to protect the credit. God didn't allow you to be surrounded because he had no intention of sharing his glory. It wasn't that people didn't want to help, it's that they were never meant to. Heaven orchestrated your solitude with surgical precision. Why? Because when justice came, there needed to be no confusion, no misattributed praise, no pastor claiming it was their anointing, no family member stepping in at the 11th hour to act as the rescuer, no mentor saying, "I always believed in you," no crowd to clap, just God and you. This wasn't neglect, this was sovereignty. I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols, says Isaiah 42:8, and God meant it. When he moves, he clears the room. When he acts, he makes sure no one else can take a bow. Have you ever wondered why no one picked up the phone? Why even those who once claimed to love you kept their distance when you needed them most? It wasn't coincidence, it was consecration. You were being separated, sanctified, not from people alone, but from misplaced dependency. Even David had to face Goliath alone. The armies of Israel stood trembling. The king offered armor that didn't fit, and David, still a boy in the eyes of men, walked out with only a sling and the Spirit of God. Why? Because if Saul had fought, the people would have praised the king. But when David stood alone and the giant fell, no one could deny that it was the Lord who brought the victory. 1 Samuel 17. I'll tell you about Lucia, a young woman abandoned by nearly everyone after her business collapsed. Friends stopped calling. Her family said, "Maybe this isn't your path." Even her church grew quiet. For over a year, she toiled in silence, praying and fasting, with nothing to show for it. But in the middle of a pandemic, she launched a small online art store, and within 3 months her work was featured in national galleries. When reporters asked who helped her rebuild, she simply said, "Only God. He was the only one who stayed." That's what divine isolation does. It ensures that when your light begins to shine, the shadows of other people's egos don't distort it. The silence wasn't absence, it was construction. Heaven was laying the foundation for a victory that no human hand could frame. Because if someone else had supported you, they would have expected credit. They would have said, "If it weren't for me." But now they can't, because they weren't there. And that was the point. Think of a lighthouse. It stands alone, battered by waves, isolated from the mainland. But in the darkest storm, it becomes the guidepost for thousands. Its isolation isn't weakness, it's what gives it power. That's you. You've been positioned, not punished. In John 11, when Lazarus died, Jesus waited 4 days before arriving. Martha and Mary were devastated. They must have thought, if he loved us, why didn't he come? But Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. John 11:4. The delay was deliberate, the isolation was strategic, and when Lazarus came out of the tomb, no one could claim they helped. No doctor, no disciple, only Jesus. So when you found yourself crying alone, walking through spiritual fire without a single helping hand, God was not missing. He was ensuring clarity. Every unanswered call, every unreturned message, every cold shoulder was heaven closing the door to outside interference. Have you noticed how diamonds are formed? Not in crowds, not under gentle light, but in the deepest places of the earth, under crushing pressure and total darkness. You didn't need more hands, you needed more fire, because what God is about to reveal through you could never be born in comfort. And now, as your season turns, the very people who watched you burn will see you rise in brilliance, and they'll have no choice but to whisper, only God could have done that. This is not vengeance wrapped in bitterness. This is justice wrapped in glory. Your isolation was never abandonment. It was divine positioning for a victory so unmistakable that even your enemies will acknowledge. This wasn't man. This was God. No imposters, no distractions, no stolen credit. Just God, alone on the stage, and you standing as his evidence. This is more than your payback. It's a prophecy in motion. Your breakthrough isn't just a personal reward. It's a thunderclap rumbling across the spiritual realm, a declaration that shakes every shadow, still harboring secret enemies. What God is doing through you isn't just about restoration. It's about revelation. It's a divine warning encoded into your rise. This one is marked. This one is guarded. This one is not to be touched. They thought your silence meant surrender. They mistook your isolation for weakness. They believed their whispers behind closed doors would never echo back into the halls of judgment. But now, those same whispers are being drowned out by a voice far louder, God's. Psalm 105, verse 15, echoes through your very being. Do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. They crossed a line they didn't even know existed. And now they're beginning to feel the consequences press into their lives in ways logic can't explain. The fear they once used to paralyze you has boomeranged, and it's not returning lightly. It's amplified, intensified, returned sevenfold, not as petty revenge, but as a holy signal. Because this isn't just about setting the record straight for you. It's about sending a message across the spiritual realm. The chosen one is no longer hiding. Let me tell you about Declan, a quiet voiceover artist whose talent was continually mocked by those in the industry. A peer once laughed behind his back, saying, "He'll never make it. He's too soft, too spiritual." What they didn't know was that Declan wasn't chasing approval. He was listening to divine timing. 2 years later, his voice became the signature sound of a global campaign, and that same peer had to audition under his direction. The shift wasn't subtle, it was supernatural. That's what happens when heaven draws the line. Have you ever watched a volcano sleep for decades, silent, dormant, unnoticed, only to erupt without warning and change the landscape forever? That's your life right now. You weren't dormant, you were divinely delayed. And now that you're rising, everything around you is adjusting, because what once tried to crush you is now beneath your feet. Even Jesus, after his resurrection, didn't immediately appear to everyone. He revealed himself to those appointed, those faithful. But the resurrection itself was a warning to every force that had mocked, beaten, and crucified him. The grave has no hold here. The power you thought you had is broken. That's the energy surrounding you now, a post-resurrection kind of momentum, one that cannot be stopped or silenced. I once heard the story of Amara, a midwife from Kenya who was falsely accused of malpractice by a jealous co-worker. Stripped of her license, she disappeared into quiet obscurity. But rather than fight with bitterness, she fasted, prayed, and kept learning. 2 years later, during a medical crisis in her region, she was the only one trained to handle a rare delivery complication. The hospital reinstated her immediately and placed her over the department. Her vindication wasn't just a reward, it was a warning to every enemy who said, "She's finished." You are now standing at that same threshold. The same people who tried to keep you small are now shrinking in their own skin, not because you retaliated, but because heaven is responding. Your presence is no longer casual, it's consecrated. You carry the weight of divine oversight, and that weight radiates. It's why rooms go silent when you walk in, why some can't look you in the eye anymore, because what once looked like weakness is now unmistakable strength clothed in authority. Have you noticed the shift? The atmosphere around you isn't what it used to be. That's not by accident. It's a spiritual perimeter. You've been marked, not with ink, but with glory, the kind that can't be removed, stolen, or ignored. Isaiah 54:17 assures you, "No weapon that is formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn." That promise wasn't just poetic, it's prophetic, and it's unfolding now. Your comeback is more than vindication, it's an alarm, a flaming sword swinging in every direction that says, "Back away." This one belongs to God. The debts are being called in, not just to reward you, but to warn every hidden adversary that grace has an edge and justice wears a crown. And if they still think they can slither through shadows to sabotage your destiny, the answer is clear. Their time is up. You are not just rising, you are radiating. This moment is more than a turning point. It is the culmination of every sleepless night, every prayer whispered through trembling lips, every unseen battle you fought while no one else believed. And now, the scale of justice is tipping, and it is not being gentle. You are walking not in survival, but in sovereignty, covered, backed, armed, and unstoppable. The game has changed, the rules are rewritten, and God is watching every single move. This isn't just a new chapter, it's a divine decree. Your life is the testimony, your rise is the warning, and your story is the shift. Let the world watch, let heaven echo, let every hidden enemy tremble, because the chosen one has arrived, and nothing will ever be the same again. Your suffering was not wasted, your silence was not weakness, and your isolation was not abandonment. It was heaven's strategy to reveal a justice so pure, so undeniable, that no one could take credit but God himself. What they did to you, God saw it all. Every lie, every betrayal, every time they laughed while you wept. But now, the same God who counted every tear is returning every loss with purpose, power, and payback. Not for vengeance, but for righteousness. Because when God repays, he does it openly, perfectly, and completely. Let your life now be a declaration. You are not the victim of your past. You are the evidence of God's justice. The very breath you breathe is a reminder to the world that God defends his own. And no weapon, no whisper, no curse spoken in secret can undo what God is doing in the open. Your story is far from over. It's just beginning, reshaped by divine hands, marked by glory, and guarded by fire. You've been through the test, and now you walk in the testimony. If this message ignited something deep in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this word with God's chosen ones. Welcome. Before we go any further, I want you to comment 777 if your spirit has ever cried out, "Where was everyone when I needed them most?" And to those who have supported this mission through super thanks, I see you, I thank you, and heaven records it. Your love fuels this message. Now listen closely, This one is sacred, not safe, not sanitized, sacred, because what you're about to hear isn't just truth, it's exposure. You didn't land on this video by mistake. This is a divine confrontation, and your soul has been summoned for a reason. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were thrown into a battle you didn't ask for, while the ones closest to you stood by and said nothing? Have you ever looked around in the middle of your storm